So, a lot of you may not know about it because I don't talk about it much on the channel, if at all. I honestly can't remember if I've talked about it at all on the channel. But I'm a huge fan of the Percy Jackson series, and the various spin-offs, and the various ancillary series that all take place within the same universe. I'm even starting to get into some of the ones that are a little more nebulously connected, the ones that the author of those books, Rick Riordan, has only helped other authors to produce. Though that's slower going than I'd like it to be, just because I don't have a lot of time. The point is, though, I really like books written in that style, with the common denominator being that they're all about various mythologies, sort of transplanted into the modern world. I've always been a huge fan of mythology, specifically Greek and Egyptian mythology, which is fortuitous because the first two series that Rick Riordan ever wrote were about Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology. And while I'm not an expert on any mythology, I have a decent range of knowledge, and one of my favorite things, like conceptually, is when mythology is transplanted into a modern setting. That's why shows like Supernatural, for example, tend to hold my interest far longer than they have any business actually doing. And so despite the fact that I actually got into the Percy Jackson series later than most people, like later in my own life than most people would, seeing as how they're on probably even the younger side of young adult, I enjoyed them immensely, and I still go back to them regularly for a little bit of familiar escapism. They are honestly a ton of fun and super fantastic, and while the characters of those books don't age with their audience as much as, say, the characters in the Harry Potter series, and this is not the last time we'll be drawing a comparison to Harry Potter in this video, I promise. The books do mature over time, so if you find them a little simplistic at the start, all you have to do is wait a couple of books and you'll be fine. I highly recommend them to anyone who likes fantasy, even to a small degree, and especially to anyone who liked Harry Potter, because while this is a very different kind of fantasy, it's still fantasy in a modern setting, centered around a sort of hidden world, one that the average person doesn't get to see. So considering how much I love this series, you can imagine how excited I was several years back when it was revealed that it was going to be adapted into a movie, that the first book in particular was going to be adapted into a movie, and that if it did well, we'd get an entire series, like Harry Potter. The trailers even looked pretty good. They weren't showing a ton from later in the movie, and what they were showing seemed to suggest that they were going to take some liberties with what the characters did throughout their various quests in that particular story. But the stuff that we were seeing more close up, more definitively, it looked pretty good. Details had been changed, the characters had been aged up a bit, but it seemed like it was going to be fun. Oh, how trailers can be deceiving. Because when I went to see the movie, I don't recall being as disappointed by anything up to that point in my entire life. At least not anything media related. It was not just a below average movie, it was an absolutely terrible adaptation of a fantastic book, which was just similar enough in the start to the book. Like the first act or so of the movie is just close enough to the first section of the book that any diehard fans of the book aren't going to notice right away how much has been changed. It really was a shame. Then they made a sequel on a substantially reduced budget and brought back the same actors, helmed by an entirely different production staff. And by God, they tried so hard to make something of the disaster that was the first book, but so much of it had to be devoted to damage control, fixing stuff that the first movie got wrong, that it barely felt like it was in the same series anyway, and it just made the story so disjointed. And part of the problem is, I don't know if a movie could ever be made of one of these books that doesn't feel disjointed for reasons I'm going to be talking about in a minute. Point is, the second movie, Sea of Monsters, was better. I will still revisit it sometimes because there are some scenes in it that are close enough that I still enjoy them in a way that I'll talk about again also in a minute. But it was also a bad movie. in part because they just didn't have the money to do everything that they needed to do. Entire swaths of the story had to be cut or vastly reduced in scale because they just didn't have the capacity to show them to us in visual form on the budget that they had. The movies also completely dropped one of the coolest things about the books. Like the Hydra. Everybody knows the Hydra, right? It's that big snake dragon monster thing that when you cut off one of its heads, it grows two more in its place, and the only way to beat it is to, like, bludgeon it to death or blow it up or something, right? In the Percy Jackson universe, monsters and the things that they do have translated into the modern world to the point that things like the Hydra are connected to real-world unsavory things. So when you cut off a Hydra's head and it grows two more in the Percy Jackson universe, two more crappy corner corporate convenience stores pop up at random. And because of the magical forces at work in this universe, nobody notices that they just appeared. They just accept that those exist now. And it lowers the quality of that entire area, which is, I guess, something that monsters want. It's not explained super well, but it's still a very interesting idea, right? Because in the mythology, the mystical forces, monsters, and gods, they all influence specific things that humans interact with on a daily basis. It makes sense that as the world changes, the things that those mystical forces influence would also change and evolve. And I can't recall a single instance in either one of the movies where something like that is even mentioned at all. All of the real world stuff happens in settings that are real world, and all of the mythological stuff happens separate from it, completely separate from it. It doesn't feel like the two worlds are integrated at all. And again, the second movie did a little bit better with this in a couple of areas, but still, the damage had already been done by the first. There wasn't really any going back at that point. Any attempt to blend the two worlds just felt so tonally inconsistent with the first movie that it hurt the story overall. And I'm bringing all this up, and I'm making this video for you guys today because fairly recently, I wanted to get this video out sooner, and wasn't able to, but fairly recently still, it started trending on Twitter. Reboot Percy Jackson, and author Rick Riordan has even been doing like actual legwork trying to get a reboot for Percy Jackson because it seems to be what the fans are wanting, like specifically right now, which is very cool of him. Rick's a very cool guy, and it could actually happen. Like, I don't want to get my hopes up, and I also don't want to, you know, rely upon Disney or, you know, give Disney any more of my money even. But the Percy Jackson series is already affiliated with Disney through Disney Publishing Worldwide, I think is the name of the company. One of the publishers of the Percy Jackson series books. And Disney does have a conspicuously new streaming service right now that they seem to really be pushing new original content for. It'd be really cool if we could get something for Disney Plus that's Percy Jackson. Even if it's not like a movie reboot, even if we could just get like some shorts or something to test the waters, even that would be super cool. And honestly, more than I ever really thought I could hope for prior to this hashtag starting to trend. But specifically, I want to talk about my hopes and wishes for the form that a full reboot would take. Now, first of all, I'm not going to even begin to speculate that more than just the 5-book Percy Jackson and the Olympian series would receive an adaptation. There have been, as I mentioned before, several spin-offs, some with the same cast or a similar cast, some with completely different casts of characters. But if we're talking just books that I would consider either Percy Jackson books or sequels to them, there has been one sequel, and there's another sequel ongoing, which is slated to finish by fall, I think, of this year. And I'd like to see all of them get adapted because they flow really well into each other. I think They're all very good in their own right, but I'm going to focus on the core Percy Jackson and the Olympians series today. That said, in order to contextualize my hopes and wishes regarding this reboot, I'm going to do something that is so original that no one has ever done it before, and I certainly haven't already done it in this video. I'm going to compare Percy Jackson to Harry Potter, because they are pretty similar. It's pretty clear that when Rick Riordan went to write the Percy Jackson series, he took some, let's say, structural inspiration from Harry Potter. You have your chosen one hero type, you have your smart girl, and you have your comic relief guy who's also braver than he seems. You even have your hidden world where characters go to learn their magical abilities. In the case of Percy Jackson, it's Camp Half-Blood, an out-of-the-way summer camp on Long Island Sound, where the children of the Greek gods can go to find safety from monsters who will seek them out naturally, and also to learn to fight and to use their godly abilities in order to defend themselves out in the real world as they get older. The difference, though, is that Percy and his friends leave the camp. They go on quests, they travel the world, and whereas the Harry Potter series, the stories in the Harry Potter series, at least the earlier ones, did have sort of an episodic feel to them, the Percy Jackson series is a truly episodic series. Each book has an overlying plot, but the adventures that the characters get up to throughout the book are broken down into little episodes. It's very much like if you've read The Hobbit. In The Hobbit, the characters face challenge after challenge, each with a beginning, middle, and end until they come to the end of their epic adventure, which caps off the entire story as a whole. The Percy Jackson books feel very much like that. Even the later ones feel very much like that, just a more serialized version of it. And I know this is going to be a controversial thing for me to say. Looking back at the Harry Potter movie adaptations, I don't want movie adaptations of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Because the Harry Potter stories were less episodic than Percy Jackson. And their adaptations weren't good. Like, don't get me wrong, I enjoy the Harry Potter movies a lot. But, like, technically speaking, from like an objective perspective, they're not good movies. They're certainly not a good series of movies. There are good things about them, and they got better over time until they suddenly got worse at the end. Because, by God, the sixth Harry Potter movie is one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. But they are terrible adaptations of the Harry Potter series, and they're only okay movies at best. I know people are going to argue this point, but I'm sorry, it's true. And part of the reason that they're such bad adaptations is because, first of all, the books started getting a lot longer as the series went on, like to the point where I think it kind of blindsided the dudes working to adapt the movies. They didn't really expect them to get that long and complicated, and therefore more and more had to be cut over time to keep the same structure as the earlier films. And also, the series wasn't finished being written when the adaptation started, and Rowling herself didn't even really know what she was going to fall back on later on in the story, i.e. what was going to be needed later on in the story. So stuff ended up getting cut that was necessary to explain stuff in later books, aka movies. So as the Harry Potter movie series goes on, they feel more and more disjointed and rely more and more on you, the viewer, having read the book. And that's the saving grace of the series. I love the Harry Potter books. Don't particularly like Rowling anymore, but I love the Harry Potter books. And sometimes I just don't have the time to sit down and reread one, and I kind of just want to relive certain moments anyway. And the movies are really good for that, if they actually accurately adapted the moment that I'm looking to relive. Because reliving it quickly in a streamlined visual package delivers the same kind of thrill as rereading that part of the book in a fraction of the time, and it looks cool too. And I think that's why the Harry Potter movies are so well remembered by so many fans, because they remind you of the things that you liked most about the books, not because they were good movies. And that's because books like Harry Potter simply aren't very easily adaptable into movies. They're long, they're episodic. Frankly, they would be better as a straight-to-streaming limited series, which is what I also want for Percy Jackson. I want a reboot of Harry Potter in that format, and more than that even, I want a reboot of Percy Jackson in that format. I feel like it's the best way that the adaptation of the books can be delivered to us in visual form, precisely because the books are already so episodic anyway. Just break the book up into literal episodes and adapt each of them while keeping the overall plot in mind for the finale. It would be so simple. I also want them to avoid aging up the characters this time. Like, I know working with kid actors is a nightmare, right? Because kids are hard to direct. They don't have a lot of experience. Most kid actors tend not to be very good anyway, even if they will get better later on. It's a hassle. I understand that. But, assuming that all 5 books in the series get adapted, you need the characters to start out young enough that by the time the 5th book rolls around, they're believable as teenagers. And that's just not something that's going to happen if you start with kids who are older than the characters were at the beginning in the first place. Because, like, I know Netflix, for example, has really streamlined how quickly you can produce a season of television for the straight-to-streaming format. But it's still, like, a year per season, right? And possibly longer than that, even. Like, look at the Series of Unfortunate Events adaptation that Netflix has been putting on for a while now. Did they finish that yet? I honestly don't know. I need to watch more of that than what I already have. Anyway, the kids in that aged more than they should have. Like, it's not the end of the world. Those books are pretty vague in terms of, like, timetables and stuff. But they've still aged more than they should have. And in Percy Jackson, a story which is dependent on a prophecy which states the character's age at the time of the prophecy's fulfillment outright, the characters aging more than they're supposed to could pose a real problem for the narrative. So you gotta use kid actors. You gotta use kid actors, and you gotta dedicate yourself to working with them. You gotta hire people who know how to work with them. It would be a challenge, but I think it'd be worth it. This is a very profitable franchise. A lot of people love it a lot. You are guaranteed a baseline viewership. 100%. Though, there is potentially a way that you could get around this problem without actually using child actors, and that's by making it animated. And I'm not 100% sure that I want the reboot to be animated. But I'm not 100% sure that I don't want the reboot to be animated either. Because as cool as live-action adaptations of fantasy works are, because, I mean, you just don't expect to ever see that kind of fantasy stuff happening in what seems to be a realistic setting, you can do so much more in animation. And we've already gotten cool quest-based animations just recently. Look at Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beast, which I'm going to be talking about again very, very soon. It's an episodic quest with an overarching plot, very much like a Percy Jackson book. And it's fantastic. Like, glorious. Like, work with somebody who knows how to do that same kind of thing. And I think a really great animated Percy Jackson could seriously be on the table. More so than anything, though, I guess what I hope for this reboot, should it come to pass, is people who actually care about the story. Like, it was very clear watching the first Percy Jackson movie that the people working on that didn't care about the story. They just wanted to make a fantasy story, and they saw this licensed property as a means by which they could do that. And while it was more clear that the people working on the second movie cared about the story than the people working on the first, again, there was no saving that movie. But, at the very least, it was clear that they had tried. It was clear that they had put the effort in. So already, just looking at those two movies, it's obvious what difference care can make. Find people who care about the story, who know what they're doing, of course, but who care about the story, and, like, this is our second try at making this work at this point, right? Because the second movie was still part of that first try, technically speaking. Learn from the mistakes of your predecessors, and I can't imagine that whoever's put in charge of this thing couldn't make something amazing, right? Like, this is probably wishful thinking. Like, it's probably wishful thinking in general that this is going to happen anytime soon. But I do at least try to be an optimist. I'm not going to change that now. I want this to happen. I want it to be great. So I'm going to keep an open mind. And I think any Percy Jackson fans in my audience should as well. In fact, if you like the ideas that I put forth here, or if you have your own, talk about them. Make your own videos about them and tweet your videos out. Tweet out your thoughts directly. Direct your tweets at Rick Riordan himself. He will listen to you. Make it clear that the hype is still real, and also make it known what you'd like to see, because, like, I don't know how much it would matter, obviously. Each one of us is just one individual voice, but enough individual voices coming together can be really freaking loud. And if we're clear that we want certain things, that we want a more accurate cast, age-wise and appearance-wise, I didn't really talk about it, but the appearance of some of the characters was wrong too. And especially if we make it clear that we want something more like a series this time rather than just a bunch of movies, I think people will listen to that too. And who knows which idea will be the one which finally sparks some inspiration in the mind of someone who can make this happen, right? But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what did you think of any of the ideas that I put forth in this video? And again, if you have your own ideas regarding which form you feel a reboot of the Percy Jackson series as an adaptation should take, let me know in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been my 2 cents on this topic. This has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.